You have compared yourself to someone else today. You may not have noticed it happening because the comparison likely required no conscious decision, no deliberate act of will. It simply occurred, automatically and almost instantaneously, the moment relevant information about another person entered your awareness. Someone mentioned a salary, and before you had time to decide whether the comparison was appropriate, you had already registered where you stood relative to that number. Someone posted a photograph from a vacation, and your mind had already begun assembling an assessment of how your own life measured up, before you had consciously chosen to make any assessment at all. This is one of the most consistent and least escapable features of human psychology, and it operates with a speed and automaticity that suggests it is not simply a bad habit or a character flaw, but something built into the basic architecture of how the human mind processes information about the social world. Understanding where this drive comes from, why it operates the way it does, and what it reveals about human nature turns out to illuminate one of the deepest and most consequential systems in human psychology. Let's begin with the foundational theory. The psychologist Leon Festinger, in a landmark 1954 paper that established social comparison as a formal object of scientific study, proposed what he called social comparison theory. Festinger's central claim was that human beings possess a fundamental drive to evaluate their own opinions and abilities, and that in the absence of objective, non-social standards for making these evaluations, people turn to comparison with other people as the primary available method of self-assessment. Festinger's theory contained an insight that has proven remarkably durable across 7 decades of subsequent research. For most of the judgments that matter most to human beings, whether they are successful, whether their abilities are adequate, whether their lives are going well, there simply is no objective, non-social yardstick available. There is no absolute scale of professional success, no universal standard for physical attractiveness, no objective measure of whether a particular life is going well. In the absence of such objective standards, Festinger proposed, the human mind defaults to a fundamentally comparative mode of evaluation, assessing the self not against some fixed external standard, but against the visible performance of other people. This theoretical framework helps explain why social comparison is not simply an occasional psychological habit, but a pervasive and largely unavoidable feature of how human beings process self-relevant information. If the fundamental currency of self-evaluation is inherently comparative, then virtually any information about another person's circumstances becomes potentially relevant to the ongoing project of assessing one's own standing, triggering the comparison process automatically and without conscious deliberation. Festinger's original theory proposed a specific structural feature of social comparison that subsequent research has extensively confirmed and elaborated: the strong preference for comparison with similar others. Festinger argued that comparisons with people who are similar to oneself in relevant respects provide the most useful information for self-evaluation, because comparisons with people who are dramatically different provide little diagnostic information about one's own actual standing or capabilities. The social psychologist Thomas Wills at Albert Einstein College of Medicine extended Festinger's framework significantly in a highly influential 1981 paper by identifying 2 distinct directions that social comparison can take, each associated with different motivations and different psychological consequences. Upward social comparison involves comparing oneself to someone perceived as superior on the relevant dimension, a comparison that can serve an inspirational or informational function, providing a model of what is achievable, but that also carries a significant risk of producing feelings of inadequacy, envy, and diminished self-regard. Downward social comparison involves comparing oneself to someone perceived as inferior on the relevant dimension. A comparison that Wills proposed serves primarily a self-enhancement function, allowing the individual to feel better about their own circumstances by contrasting them with someone worse off. Wills's research documented that the choice between upward and downward comparison is not random, but is systematically influenced by the psychological state of the person making the comparison. Individuals experiencing threats to self-esteem, including those under stress, those who have recently experienced failure, or those with generally lower self-esteem, show a robust tendency to engage in more downward social comparison, seeking out comparisons with people who are doing worse as a strategy for psychological self-protection. This finding suggests that social comparison is not simply a passive process of information gathering, but an active and often strategically deployed tool for emotional regulation. The evolutionary psychologist Sarah Hill at Texas Christian University, together with David Buss at the University of Texas at Austin, has proposed an evolutionary account of why social comparison operates with such automaticity and such consistent structural features across human cultures. Hill and Buss argue that the psychological machinery underlying social comparison evolved because relative standing within a social group, rather than absolute resource level, was the more direct determinant of reproductive success throughout most of human evolutionary history. This claim requires some unpacking because it runs counter to the intuitive assumption that what would matter most for survival and reproduction is simply having sufficient resources in an absolute sense. Hill and Buss's argument is that in ancestral human social groups, most forms of status, mating opportunity, and access to cooperative partnerships were inherently zero-sum, or relatively so. There was only one highest status position in the group, only a limited number of the most desirable mates, and access to the most valuable cooperative partnerships was necessarily allocated based on how an individual, compared to others, competing for the same limited opportunities. In this competitive social context, an individual's absolute level of skill, resources, or attractiveness mattered less than how that level compared to the other individuals competing for the same limited social opportunities. This evolutionary logic, Hill and Buss propose, explains why the human mind evolved to track relative standing so automatically and so continuously, rather than evaluating circumstances against some fixed absolute standard. A psychological system tuned to relative standing would have produced more adaptive behavior in the ancestral environment than a system tuned to absolute resource levels, because relative standing was the more reliable predictor of actual reproductive and survival outcomes. The social psychologist Shelley Taylor, whose research on positive illusions we have examined in an earlier video in this series, has documented that social comparison processes are involved in an enormous range of psychological phenomena beyond simple self-esteem regulation, including coping with illness, adjustment to disability, and the maintenance of psychological well-being under conditions of chronic stress. Taylor's research on women coping with breast cancer found that patients systematically and spontaneously engaged in downward social comparison, comparing themselves to women whose situations they perceived as worse, as an active coping strategy that helped maintain psychological equilibrium during a period of significant threat. What makes this finding particularly significant is that it demonstrates social comparison is not simply an automatic reflex that happens to people, but can also function as a form of active psychological self-management, deployed strategically, whether consciously or unconsciously, to help regulate emotional states in response to genuinely difficult circumstances. There is a further dimension of social comparison research that deserves careful attention because it addresses a specific puzzle that the basic upward-downward framework does not fully resolve. Why comparisons with people who are close to us, whether in physical proximity, social relationship, or perceived similarity, tend to produce more intense psychological effects than comparisons with people who are more distant, even when the objective magnitude of the difference being compared is identical. The social psychologist Abraham Tesser at the University of Georgia developed what he calls the self-evaluation maintenance model to address this puzzle, proposing that the psychological impact of a social comparison depends not simply on whether it is upward or downward, but on the interaction between the closeness of the person being compared to and the relevance of the dimension being compared. Tesser's research found that when someone close to us, a sibling, a close friend, a romantic partner, outperforms us on a dimension that is highly relevant to our own sense of identity and self-worth, the comparison produces significantly more distress than an equivalent outperformance by a stranger. This is what Tesser calls the comparison process, and it can produce genuine strain in close relationships when both parties care about the same domain of achievement. However, Tesser also documented a countervailing process he calls the reflection process, in which the achievements of someone close to us can produce increased, rather than decreased self-esteem, but only when the dimension of achievement is not particularly central to our own identity. In this case, the close other's success can be experienced as a kind of basking in reflected glory, in which their accomplishment becomes a source of pride and positive association rather than threat, precisely because it does not compete with our own sense of who we are and what we are good at. Tesser's model helps explain a phenomenon that many people recognize from their own experience, but that would be puzzling under a simpler comparison framework. Why it can feel considerably more threatening to see a close friend or sibling succeed in your own specific professional field than to see a complete stranger achieve the same success. And why, conversely, we often feel genuine pride and pleasure at the achievements of people close to us in domains unrelated to our own aspirations. The critical variable, in Tesser's account, is not simply closeness or comparison direction alone, but the specific intersection between relational closeness and domain relevance to one's own identity. This research connects to a broader body of work on what social psychologists call the social comparison and self-relevance interaction, which has significant implications for understanding envy specifically as distinct from ordinary upward comparison. The psychologist Richard Smith at the University of Kentucky, who has conducted extensive research specifically on the psychology of envy, has documented that envy is not simply the emotional consequence of any upward comparison, but arises specifically when the upward comparison involves a domain that is central to the envious person's own identity, and when the advantage possessed by the other person is perceived as at least somewhat attainable, rather than categorically out of reach. Smith's research has found that people rarely report envy toward individuals whose advantages are perceived as entirely disconnected from any realistic possibility for themselves, such as ordinary people envying a professional athlete's physical gifts in a sport they have never played. Envy instead concentrates specifically around comparisons involving people who are similar enough, in relevant respects, that their success implies something uncomfortable about what might have been possible for the envious person themselves, had circumstances or choices been different. This finding refines the basic social comparison framework considerably. The most psychologically potent comparisons are not simply those involving the largest objective gap in outcomes, but those involving people similar enough to make the gap feel personally implicating. The neuroscience of social comparison has developed considerably over the past 2 decades, providing direct evidence about the neural mechanisms underlying this psychological process. The neuroscientist Armin Falk at the University of Bonn conducted an influential brain imaging study examining how the human reward system responds not simply to the absolute value of a reward, but to the reward relative to what other people received. Falk's research found that when participants received a fixed monetary reward, activation in the ventral striatum, a core component of the brain's reward circuitry, was substantially modulated by information about how much other participants had received for the same task. Activation was higher when the participant received more than others, and lower when the participant received the same absolute amount, but learned that others had received more. This finding provides direct neurological evidence for a claim that behavioral economists have documented extensively through choice experiments. Human beings do not process reward and well-being in purely absolute terms. The subjective value of a given outcome is substantially shaped by the comparative context in which it occurs, such that an objectively identical outcome can produce genuinely different levels of neurological reward activation, depending on how it compares to the outcomes received by relevant others. The economist Richard Layard at the London School of Economics has drawn on this body of research to document what has become known as the Easterlin paradox in the economics of well-being, named for the economist Richard Easterlin, who first documented that increases in absolute national income over time do not produce corresponding increases in average reported life satisfaction, even though cross-sectional comparisons within a single country at a single point in time reliably show that wealthier individuals report higher life satisfaction than poorer individuals in the same society. Layard's analysis of this apparent paradox connects directly to social comparison theory. If well-being depends substantially on relative rather than absolute economic standing, then a society in which everyone's income rises together will not produce a corresponding rise in average well-being, because everyone's relative standing remains essentially unchanged even as absolute resources increase. This finding has significant implications for understanding why economic growth alone has proven a surprisingly poor predictor of increases in reported happiness at the societal level, a finding that has generated substantial debate and remains an active area of research in the economics of well-being. The contemporary relevance of social comparison research has been amplified enormously by the emergence of social media platforms, which have fundamentally transformed the scale, frequency, and content of the social comparisons that human beings are exposed to on a daily basis. The psychologist Miley Steers at the University of Houston has documented that the specific structure of social media environments, in which users are continuously exposed to the carefully curated, selectively positive self-presentations of a very large number of other people, creates conditions that are systematically biased toward upward social comparison, the form of comparison most reliably associated with decreased well-being and increased envy. Steers' research found that time spent passively browsing social media, specifically viewing the curated content of others rather than actively posting or interacting, was significantly associated with increased depressive symptoms, and that this relationship was substantially mediated by the frequency of upward social comparisons the participant reported making while browsing. This finding illuminates a specific mismatch between the evolved psychology of social comparison and the modern social media environment. The human comparison system evolved in a context where the number of people available for comparison was limited to a relatively small, stable social group, and where the information available about those people's circumstances was reasonably accurate because it was based on direct observation over extended periods. The modern social media environment provides an essentially unlimited pool of comparison targets, most of whom are complete strangers, and the information available about those targets is systematically biased toward positive self-presentation, since users have strong incentives to present idealized versions of their lives rather than accurate or representative ones. The evolved comparison system, calibrated for a world of accurate information about a small, stable group, is confronted with a world of curated information about an effectively unlimited group, and it responds by generating comparison-driven distress at a scale and frequency that the ancestral environment never produced. There is also an important developmental dimension to this research that illuminates when and how the capacity for social comparison first emerges in human cognitive development, which sheds light on how deeply embedded this psychological system actually is. The developmental psychologist Susan Butler at the University of Cambridge has documented that children begin engaging in recognizable social comparison behavior remarkably early, well before they possess the more sophisticated cognitive capacities, such as full theory of mind or complex numerical reasoning, that might seem to be prerequisites for meaningful comparative self-evaluation. Butler's research found that children as young as 3 years of age show clear behavioral evidence of monitoring how their own performance and rewards compare to those of peers, including seeking out information about how much a peer received in a reward allocation task, even when doing so provided no direct benefit to the child's own outcome. This early emergence is theoretically significant because it suggests that the drive toward social comparison is not a sophisticated cognitive achievement built on top of more basic capacities, but is instead one of the earliest emerging components of social cognition, present in a recognizable form before children have fully developed many of the other cognitive capacities that adult social comparison seems to depend upon, such as explicit numerical reasoning about relative quantities or a fully developed theory of mind. Butler's findings are consistent with the view that social comparison reflects an ancient and deeply conserved psychological system rather than a late-developing product of sophisticated human reasoning. The cross-cultural dimension of this research provides an important complement to the developmental evidence, addressing the question of whether the drive towards social comparison, while apparently very early emerging and cognitively basic, is nonetheless substantially shaped or amplified by particular cultural contexts. The cross-cultural psychologist Hazel Marcus at Stanford University, whose extensive research on cultural variation in self-construal has been foundational in cultural psychology, has documented that while the basic drive toward social comparison appears to be a human universal, its specific behavioral expression and psychological consequences vary considerably between cultures organized around what she calls independent versus interdependent self-construals. Marcus's research found that in cultures with a more independent self-construal, characteristic of much of North American and Western European society, social comparison tends to be organized around individual achievement and personal distinctiveness, with downward comparison functioning primarily as a self-enhancement strategy for the individual making the comparison. In cultures with a more interdependent self-construal, characteristic of much of East Asian society, social comparison tends to be organized more centrally around group harmony and relational obligation, with upward comparison to successful in-group members sometimes functioning less as a threat to individual self-esteem and more as a source of collective pride and motivation to contribute to shared group standing. This cross-cultural variation is theoretically important because it demonstrates that while the underlying drive towards social comparison appears to be a deeply conserved and early emerging feature of human psychology, present in recognizable form even in young children across very different cultural contexts, the specific psychological consequences of that comparison, whether it produces threat and diminished self-esteem or motivation and collective pride, are substantially shaped by the broader cultural framework within which the comparing individual is embedded. The comparison itself may be close to a human universal. What the comparison means and how it is experienced is not. What emerges from this body of research is a picture of social comparison not as a psychological weakness to be overcome, but as a fundamental and largely inescapable feature of how the human mind evaluates self-worth, status, and well-being. A system that evolved because relative standing was genuinely predictive of survival and reproductive success throughout most of human evolutionary history, and that continues to operate with the same automaticity in a modern environment that has dramatically amplified both the scale and the systematic distortion of the comparison information available. You did not choose to compare yourself to the person whose success you noticed today. The comparison arrived before the choice was available, generated by a psychological system that has been tracking relative standing within social groups for longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Understanding this does not make the comparisons stop, but it does change what they mean. The sting of an unfavorable comparison is not evidence that you are inadequate. It is evidence that an ancient system, built for a world of 150 people you actually knew, is now processing information about millions of strangers it was never designed to evaluate. The system is not malfunctioning. It is simply and understandably out of its depth. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.